Well, thank you. I want to say how much I'm thankful for this invitation from my dear friend John, who has this quality of making you feel always welcome everywhere, so, which is rare. And I'm very excited. I've been watching these lecture series as a PhD student from my peripheral office in Paris for many years, so I'm particularly both honored and touched to be on the other side now. My presentation today is basically a presentation of my dissertation and where I'm taking it from now. My main claim is that the international legal and regulatory project that promotes peace is being transformed, once again, it's not the first time, into a new governance project that aims at promoting no longer peace, but rather security. So the product that emerged with Enlightenment and started to be formalized in the 19th century, that aimed at promoting peace by framing war, by prohibiting war eventually, making peace normal and war pathological, that project has metamorphosed into, towards an appeal for something that is a secure world, right? So of course security compared to peace is both broader and somehow less ambitious than peace. So it's broader because it encompasses more things than just the lack of violence, right? It encompasses stability, it concerns health, finance, legal security. I mean, security is a much wider term that refers to many other things. But it is also, it's partly less ambitious, so in this sense it's more ambitious because it encompasses, it's a larger project, right, to make the world secure. It's many other aspects than just peace. But also less ambitious because it sort of lives with the idea that we're going to keep having violence, right? It breaks with the dream that violence will eventually disappear in a peaceful world, right? So we'll always live with violence, we just have to manage it. And here comes what I think is what's determinant about this new project, and that is common with many transformation that's happening now in global governance, is that the ideal is not to regulate or to frame or to create institutions as international maybe was proposing to, but rather to manage that problem, right? It's constituting a global problem, which is security, and managing it, rather than framing it or regulating it or prohibiting it. So I believe that this transformation, right, from peace to security, this managerial transformation in global governance has partly been undermined in international legal scholarship. And that's a bit paradoxical because a lot of international in the past decade has been dedicated to talk about war, right? In the 90s and 2000s, talking about war has taken a lot of energy from international lawyers, right? But they're mainly focused on both the development of international criminal law, extraordinary development of a whole field and institutions, and a total new avenue in the second part of the 20th century, particularly since the 90s, right? On the other hand, a big focus in the revival of the UN Security Council after the Cold War that suddenly had a rebirth and started managing the use of force, or regulating the use of force with a new commitment, right? And so both these fields have maintained a lot of activity, but what I claim is that in the background of this activity, there was a development of an administration of violence, a much more regulatory work that was happening, maybe in other institutions, and that was actually framing another project at the same time. And that is this project of managing security at the global plane. I'm going to try to show you where I locate this and what are the typical tools that this project was relying on. So I'm going to try to look at instruments that are both within international law, as we traditionally conceive it, and sometimes outside of it, right? More informal regulatory instruments that we often conceive as outside of international law. So I'm trying to keep an eye on what has changed within international law in the way we interpret our institutions, and what's also happening outside of it in managerial practices of international organization, for instance. So what do I consider, just to give a hint already of what I consider to be managerial? What does this word bring to the discussion? It's basically another way of dealing with problems. I hinted to the idea that it's managing a problem that's been conceived at the global level: poverty, environment, security, right? Managing these problems and not necessarily constructed them as separate legal institutions, right? It's also the idea that we move from a binary or categorical mode of thinking into a spectral mode of thinking, right? It's not classifying things in different categories or in different legal definitions by determining the difference between war and peace or wealth and development, developed and non-developed countries, that sort of binary distinction, but it's rather to have a spectral assessment of a level of security, a level of growth, a level of development. This sort of spectral idea that give rest on the idea that we have a better view on what's happening if we get rid of the categories that qualify the situation in a specific way. So spectral, because resting on data, right? Something that's very particular or telling about this managerial project is that it's hyperfactual, right? It has an incredible faith in data, especially quantified data, and so it rests mainly its observation of the world that is supposed to be super sophisticated on a hyperfactual, on amounting a large amount of data, and I think this is where managerialism becomes very powerful when it also rests, and maybe I'm going to have time to talk about it, on powerful technical digital devices that manage data at a scale that we haven't maybe foreseen before, right? This big data move in the way we I think, imagine that we can cover the world. And how is this data dealt with? What are we trying to do with it? Basically, I think that what's particularly typical of the reasonings that managerial governance rests on is the idea that we want to be cost efficient and therefore preventive. Right? We don't want problems to arise, we want to capture them before they come. Right? We're trying to forecast constantly with these data what's going to happen, right? And in order to have cost efficient intervention on the global plane. And this is what I understand as being risk management, right? So what we're trying to tackle is risk, so things that can be negative for the global plane, and we're trying to foresee how they're going to happen and measure when is the optimal moment to intervene. So the two underlying questions that are leading this research is both what are the contemporary transformation that international law is going through, right? This is the background question. What's happening in global governance, and concomitantly, what is it doing to the institution that we know is war, right? How is it changing actually the institution that we know from within? How it's redesigning what we understand as being war. So it's both descriptive in a sense and understood as a window to wider background changes in the pattern of international policy. So at a more methodological level, I look both, I was saying pragmatically, at the type of norms that are inside and outside international law and how do I select them, because there's a variety of them. I basically look at the one that I consider have a big effect on the global plane, so it's a very pragmatic sort of approach. And that have a claim to be global and that are trying to manage violence or security at the global level, right? So this field of global governance, you probably are familiar with it, has already identified a series of these instruments, right? We have global administrative law, legal pluralism. A lot of people are invested now for 20 years into trying to describe these new regulatory tools, but little, I mean, they're mostly focused in economic law or investment or trade. They haven't really tapped into the core of international law, which is war, or at least a fantasy world of international is that it's all, I mean, the most political, the most central topic, the least susceptible to be globalized or to be informalized would be war. This is where my skepticism comes in. So how did we get here? So that's one of the way of understanding what's specific about the managerial project that aims at managing security at the global level, is to understand how is it different from previous projects. So I have I had PowerPoints I'm not showing eventually, but where I was I'm trying to map the different types of mode of thinking that we have in international in the 20th century. Right? We started with formalism, where we would decide that war is war because there was a declaration of war or a peace treaty, right? And in between, this was the institution of war. It's a very formal way of describing what war is. We moved to a more factual approach with the League of Nations and later the Charter. And in a sense, the Hague Convention and the Geneva Convention, where we're trying not to grasp what is war or in a formal sense, but it's this first move towards a factualism, where we change terminology and we start trying to grasp when there is use of force or when there is an armed conflict, resting on a sort of objectifying factualist approach of the matter. And then a move to a more functional approach of these regimes, where the idea of a threat to international community, a threat to the international security appears, right? This word security gets more place at the turn of the 70s, for instance, with the additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions that try to have a hand now on non-international conflict and try to move away from the pure interstate form of conflictuality. And eventually, after functionalism, the last move would be this move to managerialism, where risk, security, and stability become the key word. So each of these modes of thinking rests on different types of authority, different types of actors, different types of instruments. So I'm going to go directly to the managerialism to get right to the point, but I'm happy to discuss how I map this evolution and this transformation in the history of international law. In a narrative, in one genealogy of international law. It's not all-encompassing, obviously. So what are the typical instruments of managerial governance? I think that in security, there is the classical bundle of corporate social responsibility tools, right? So we have contracts in which we start to add human rights clauses, humanitarian clauses for corporations operating in high-risk zone. This is the terminology that appears, because we don't want to define whether it's an armed conflict or not. This is a question that is way too formal, and so we get away from these definitions by using terms like high-risk zones or high-violence zone, in which we want actors to indiscriminately comply with human rights or humanitarian law. And here the qualification already is not really relevant. We rest on code of conduct, right? So a good example, I think, to tell this story is, for instance, the way private military contractor got regulated, right? They start operating in sort of an empty space between the prohibition of mercenaries and the neoliberal possibility to act across territorial boundaries for cooperation. They get very big in the 90s, 2000, and so the call to regulate these corporations becomes stronger and stronger as much as they start being preeminent actors of global security. And so we start by putting human rights clauses or humanitarian law clauses in their contracts. It doesn't work. It's very costly to go to court with these clauses. And so they basically organize themselves around codes of conduct. There are several, and eventually they centralize around one code of conduct that is designed by a multi-stakeholder initiative, by states, NGOs, and corporations that get around the table to write one code of conduct. That's one code of conduct that is now into force, is also translated into a technical standard. So the association that is in Geneva, as one should when doing international things, is certifying corporations that say adhere to the guidelines, to the code of conduct, right? So this association offers certification to corporations that decide to obey to this code of conduct, and offers also a private complaint mechanism, right? So the full spectrum of an international legal operator, but from a total sidetracked from the traditional institution of international law for understandable reasons, also formal reasons, right? Because they're dealing with non-state actors. Also, these technical guidelines, code of conduct, technical standards, private complaint mechanisms. Standards are extremely strong in everything that's related to cybersecurity, for instance, entirely being regulated almost by technical standards. So an attention to these types as well, I think, is very important. Another type of typical instrument of that kind of managerial project is the use of indicators. Right? We are more and more familiar with governance indicators from the World Bank and from the OECD. Well, if you look at them, there is an increasing dimension of security criteria and security measurements within these tools. And there are all sorts of private also actors that promote ranking of states. The Global Peace Index ranks states according to their peace level. So here you have really this spectral idea that's really embodied, the idea that we are not classifying countries as war or war. We're trying to have a spectrum of a level of security that you can benefit from in one or the other country. So it's initially the primary customer of these products are corporations, are trying to evaluate how beneficial it would be to work in this or this country. So these rankings are used by corporations, but also made their way up to the global plane or the international plane within international organizations that now use these instruments and these measurement of violence much more frequently. And finally, a more technological tool is the algorithmic tool. So it's hard to put it in one box. There are algorithmic devices, regulatory devices in robots. So maybe you've heard of, and I know that Frank Pasquale was here, I don't know if you were here, but to talk about killer robots, or the idea that we're going to embed criteria or legal criteria such as distinction or proportionality within an artificial intelligence that would be compliant to these criteria. There is that, but there is also outside of the battlefield a series of regulatory devices that rest on algorithmic decision making or algorithmic data processing in financial regulation that fight against terror. Right, so the idea that banks should be tracking transaction to find suspicious transaction and flag suspicious transactions that they suspect are financing terrorism. So that's an obligation that rests on financial institutions, right? That comes from international law, right? International, the task force to fight against terrorists in the OECD provides guidelines for states to be implementing these obligations on financial institutions. And more generally in the cybersecurity world, there's a lot of instruments that are trying to have a real-time security assessment of breaches of cybersecurity. So these algorithmic tools, in a sense, make the indicator a bit dusty, because the indicator is like once a year you have one picture that's a bit old already about the situation in a country, where algorithmic devices with the same mindset or the same project are a real-time, constant assessment of how the security state is in one or the other situation. So who are the people who are doing that? Of course, there are private actors, but to go back to a more to the center of what we consider being international law or global governance, or where it's happening. Of course, if you look at this instrument, central bodies such as the International Court of Justice or the UN Security Council are a bit decentralized, right? They're not at the core of this project. That doesn't mean that they do nothing. So the UN Security Council is, besides its very well-regarded activity in implementing the Chapter 7, has also all sorts of more managerial projects in peacekeeping, peace prevention, and so, for instance, has adopted a turn towards preventing conflict, right? So a very preventive tour where they're trying to have a early warning mechanism, and all sorts of more managerial devices are trying to grasp conflict before they start, etc. They have a negotiating toolbox, a peacemaker initiative that is giving you clauses of peace agreements to to negotiate very quickly. It's a very, very toolboxy managerial way of dealing with conflict also, right? It's not only just Chapter 7, there's also a background activity of the UN Security Council that's much more, in tune with these risk assessments or conflict assessments tradition. But more permanently, so that's one aspect. But more permanent, I think what's very determinant in this move is the move that is made by the World Bank and the OECD around 2010. So the World Bank publishes a report on the world, so their annual report, the World Development Report in 2011, is on conflict. And with this move, they link basically development with security, and they say, well, you cannot actually develop if you have insecurity, if you have conflict. And so by making this link, they suddenly get a hand on conflict, war, violence. And this is how this topic becomes an economic topic or a topic of relevance for World Bank. And suddenly developing indicator tools, etc., to manage violence, right? It comes with this. At the same time, the OECD is developing guidelines for companies operating in high-risk zones, is developing all sorts of CSR tools to fight against conflict diamonds, and is starting to produce a report on fragility that is measuring every year the fragility of states, which includes in large part their vulnerability to conflict. So it's a very particular and prudential, if you want, actuarial way of seeing what is a conflict, right? There's a series of correlated data with death tolls, by the reasons of the deaths, etc., that are all correlated to measure a level of fragility or not in a state. And with these concurrent that happens, both of them happens. I'm sure I don't have a good explanation, but right after the economic crisis, suddenly these institutions, I don't know exactly why, decide that this is the moment to address conflict and war as a topic. Right? Of course, the EU, the World Economic Forum, the International Standardization Organization all have their part also. I'm happy to discuss the tools they provide, but basically everybody is getting on board with this idea that a global actor should have a say, or at least a picture of security in the world. On the private side of things, of course, we have think tanks, corporations coming up with tools, tech companies, and maybe I'll have to go back to that, also developing all sorts of very interesting algorithmic devices that have at least as an ambition to help managing the war at the global level. So what do they have in common? Just maybe now we have a better sense of what these instruments are about. This investment in measurement and quantification of data, right? They forecast future events, and also they are supposed to allow individualized, targeted intervention at the global level. So the idea that we move away from massive regulatory legal frameworks that come with a whole regime, just because in war you had, well, a certain intensity and a certain type of conflict, actors in a conflict, suddenly a whole legal regime was going to be applied on this situation. We don't want that. We want just more targeted, located intervention, right? We don't want to fight terror by saying that IHL is applicable everywhere all the time. We just want to be able to just kill this guy then at this moment, right? So just more targeted and cost-efficient type of intervention, but that, of course, totally redesigns the way we think about, among other things, exception. So now what does it change exactly about war? What does this cost-benefit analysis of risk change? So I'm going to take two angles, very classical material aspect of war, right? What is the intent? What is violence? What is war at the material level? And what is it at the personal level? Who gets to the war? So, there's a history of how we conceived war in the international law, and it's changing all the time. It's constantly contested. We basically start with the idea that it's special people that do war, states. Then we move to a more factual idea that we have to have a certain level of intensity, and slowly the level of intensity lowers, the requirement to move to a war situation lowers, but gets more complicated, more sophisticated, because it also is understood in relation to other factors, right? The situation, the kind of actors that participate, etc., etc. To the point, so this lowering of intensity, of course, favors intervention at a lower level, and the idea that security is a concern that is an everyday concern. And basically what happened, so I'm going very quick, but eventually what we have in the situation that we have now is that the question of intensity is almost obsolete. There is very little energy spent in determining what's the level of intensity that requires implementing IHL or going to the chapter 7. Or at least this discussion is very quickly dismissed, and what we focus on is proportionality. What we want to know if the use of force is proportional to whatever risk there is, right? And this also has a history, right? The idea that proportionality is the center of the discussion of the use of force or IHL. There have some relevance in both regimes in different ways. I think it's also a signifier of that move to a cost-benefit analysis, because it's also a very particular way to understand proportionality that's not always been like this. Proportionality actually appears very late in the history of international law. It's still contested when adopted so now we say that it was adopted in the additional protocol in 77, but actually when you look at the text, it's not there. The word is not there, and it's actually in the discussion in adoption of this protocol is discussed and dismissed. People don't want proportionality then, so they don't use the word. They use another more articulate formulation, but they don't want the word proportionality there. But 10 years later, when the commentator of the protocol comments, it says, well, of course there's proportionality, and since then, every IHL class tells you that proportionality has always been there in the history of times in understanding what is used in battle. Well, actually, when you look at it, it's very recent. And actually, when it starts, it's a proportionality that rests on the analysis on the effects of attacks. And now it's a very preventive measure when we're trying to basically preclude from breaching in IHL. It's becoming a decision tool that's a preventive decision tool. So we move from an effect-based proportionality calculus to a risk-based proportionality calculus, in which we are constantly moving to a more prudential way, in which it's always better to act when the threat is low. But that means that it's more often an occasion to respond. Understand the calculation. We are not waiting for violence to be high to respond. We think that it's more cost efficient to respond when it's low, but then it's always low. And so this also allows of a everyday use of force that we can see in daily situation. I mean, the daily news constantly feeds you with this idea that it's more acceptable now to use force against a migrant or a resistance fighter, because we don't need to go in long length to justify this, right? Because it's cost efficient, at least it avoids the full-blown war, right? So preventiveness and low-level intervention is also based on the idea that we also sort of slice targets, right? We slice the instances in which we make this calculus. This calculus is also reduced in scope, right? We used to have a more general approach, more holistic calculation of proportionality, and now it's reduced. The more you slice the events, right? It's like a tiny event, a tiny target, the more you have justification to go, because the cost, the collateral damage is none, right? But if you take an overall approach, then the calculation is entirely different. Right? So there's also, with this constant slicing and sophistication of the target, a political economy of the test that makes it more easy to use force than with larger calculus. And of course, these actual way of so this is in proportionality outside of international laws per se, all these indicators and tools basically map the world in which fragile situations are an occasion to intervene, and the same calculus appear at a more regulatory level, right? It's always easier to intervene in situations that are not yet full war, and so this also opens the door for intervention in situations that would maybe in a classical international framework would consider this intervention in internal affairs, right? But in this situation, the lowering of the threshold of what is justifiably a situation of fragility or crisis, etc., creates opportunities for it to intervention. But again, when you do a discriminative analysis, it's always the same people that get targeted, it's always the same people that get to attack. It doesn't totally change the winners and losers of this. It's just done in a different way. And I think it also changes the possibility that we have in using force at the global level. The personal level also changes tremendously. More and more private actors are encompassed in war. So both in jus ad bellum, suddenly armed groups and then terrorists get to be threat to international security. So the personal axis of war also gets finer and more specific. It's not only states that partake. Jus ad bellum also, we have a combatancy criteria that's originally linked to nationality and then to the participation in an army, so very collective and formal understanding of what combatancy means, and it becomes this almost Uberized version in the last understanding of IHL, that is, you can have a temporary direct participation to hostilities when you behave like a combatant for a very limited amount of time, right? You suddenly take up arms and go. You don't have to be qualified as a combatant throughout the length of the conflict, but just because you behaved as a combatant, you are a combatant. So it's become the more individualized and temporal and targeted way of stripping the civilian protection, so within the interpretation of international law, but also outside in more regulatory fields. The profiling of terrorist or risky behavior is ubiquitous in both financial compliance mechanisms, where we have these both databases and algorithmic devices that constantly monitor transaction that seems suspicious and that exclude people from banking system, for instance, because they perform dangerous behavior. It's also profiling suspicious behavior in border control. In many instances, you become a target because you behave in a certain way. Some of you may know that in targeted killings, for instance, you can become a target not because we have information on who you are, but because there is a correlation of data that signals that you have a behavior that is similar to a behavior of a combatant, right? With this link, this very mild behavioral link, the status of combatant can design you as a target. So your behavior, alike the combatant, can design you as a target and justify a killing in at least in the American procedures of decisions for a targeted killing. So, in conclusion, this whole picture is a bit dramatic. Why is this interesting? I think that, or at least what is our job now when we have this picture, is basically understand what we're not seeing in this, because of course we have these tools that at least pretend that they have a better picture of the world, but what is not in the picture? What is missing in this, and what are we losing and what are we gaining in these pictures? Basically, I think that at least my first intuitive reaction is what is not in any of these very granular and very sophisticated pictures of reality is that there is no place for political motives, right? There is no political violence at all. The motives for which you would use violence totally disappear from the map. There is no room to argue for the reasons why you would be violent, right? So there's a lot of context in a sense because we have data there. So the number of deaths is correlated with a very sophisticated amount of data, income, wealth, life expectancy, a lot of things. I mean, we have a very accurate picture of fragile situation, but there are things that are not in this data, right? Is why do people do that, for instance? So that I think is very important that it's really, I mean, it was part of the project of international law to technicize these debates, right? To make it less political. But maybe we've reached a stage in which it's that extreme that there is no room to even understand, not even discuss, but understand the motives that are driving the actors. The only thing that we see is their behavior. right? Regardless of their motives. In a sense, I think that this is the expression of a very Foucauldian, picture of the world, a governmentality that is implemented through surveillance, through disciplining subjects. Our subjects is not only individual; it can be really traces of behavior, transactions. So subjects are also constituted in very different ways, and I think that basically, I'm happy to think about how technology is also advancing this in a particular way. But basically, I think it calls for a new political economy of how we construe legitimate violence, state violence, and understand what we're missing in this hyper-factualized, hyper-pixelized picture of the world, and at least engage with these instruments and not negate them as being outside of international. I think maintains this idea, maintains them in a way, in a position in which they can develop without any discussion with international lawyers whose job is to deal with war and security. Thank you.
I think this is super interesting, first of all. My main question, which is also, I have personal motives for asking it. You mentioned the effect. You mentioned the effects of those acts and all those different regulatory tools that you want to keep in international law because we see legal. How did you define effect? What type of effect were you looking at?
A regulatory effect.
Ah, okay. Other than regulatory effect? So regulatory effect in what sense? In sense that they regulate,
or at least they modify the way people behave according to them in the international level. So it's not formally binding, but if you need to be certified by a standard to be able to pass a contract with your main contractor, right, with the state, of course it's not formally binding that you do, but I think that it has regulatory effect to a strength that is relevant for approach. So it's not a strict rule, but I look at instruments that are not just totally in the air, that have a regulatory effect, regardless of their bindingness at a formal level.
Okay.
There's a tradition of that. I mean, it's a pragmatic way of looking at bindingness, not a formal way.
I have no questions, but other people can ask them.
Sure.
Okay, the other thing that I was thinking is that you were mentioning that you mapped sort of the changes that we had in security and peacekeeping and how we turn back to prevention and so on and so forth. But it seems that, to me, and maybe you disagree, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the techniques changed. Some of the goals are pretty much the same. Like prevention was pretty much how peacekeeping started, and then we had a change in how much they got involved and how much force they were using, and then in terms of goals and the bigger spectrum, it seems like if we go back, but then again the methods we use are different. And the last thing I will ask now is, so overall, would you argue that it is sort of wrong that we're moving from categories to a spectrum?
Big questions. So prevention, I think that the move towards prevention is older than just in the last decade, obviously. But that, for instance, the development of peacekeeping is not entirely external to that. I think it's part of the first initiative that we had towards this fantasy that if we get there before, then it's going to get better. And then this project failed. And so we move to other things. But I think it's basic, or at least I tend to make it part of the same genealogy of this idea, that the earlier we go, the better. The less intensive it is. But still it remained a bit cost intensive, this idea of having peacekeeping force, etc., etc. So I think it's part of the same project where I agree with you that we moved method because the ideal is still driving, but the pragmatics of it are changing, right? So we're changing tools because it's not working, so we're going something else, somewhere else. But I think that the whole idea that we want to have an efficient project is already at work in peacekeeping, but maybe it's more functional. It's still, I mean, my chronology, I would put it more in the functional time, where we want not efficiency, but efficacy. We want it to work. We're less we're looking at the cost less than now. We want it to work. Does it work? It doesn't work. Even if it's expensive, we're ready to pay. That's what I mean. But this didn't work. And so we're moving much more to a cost-benefit analysis, which, okay, whatever. We want something that also not only works, but at a lower cost. And I think this is maybe a drive away from heavy artillery peacekeeping mechanism towards more fluid and managerial peace management, actually. Right? That's my intuition. Is it wrong? I don't know. I think, like every international project, there are goods and bads. And there are things that I am seduced by in this project, and things that I'm very horrified by. So the one thing that I don't want is this description to come with a nostalgia of what was before, right? So I don't mean to say, oh, look at these horrible managerial people. I love the international law dream. I probably do, but I think that we need to remain critical of what was there too, right? What it came with, this liberal dream, all sorts of illusion that made these projects fail and fail and fail. All sorts of, colonialism, embedded colonialism that is still here but in different shapes. So I don't want this to be a nostalgia towards category and a world in which was wonderful because we knew when we were at war and we knew when we were at peace. I think this came with a lot of problem too, that the international critical legal scholars have been talking about for now quite a while. But to renew this thought, I think we need to look at what's going on now without fetishizing what was happening before. So categories has lots of problems too. And spectral has pluses, but also problems. But I guess that looking at it through a more distributive analysis or a political economy of what's produced is more important than just being... I'm an international lawyer. I'm not particularly seduced by this managerial style, aesthetic, right? It's not my thing. But I get to, but I think that by being a bit reverent to it, a bit curious about it, and looking at it a bit with patience, you get to see how it's not just a bad taste aesthetic. It comes with a very ambitious political project. And I think this has been undermined. So Koskenemi has talked about managerialism since 2000. But I think he uses it as almost a derivative word. It's like, oh, managerialism is, low-class regulation. But I think he misses that it's actually a very ambitious intellectual project. That is maybe law being put at work by law and economics, let's say. But it's much wider than this, I think. And that's what I'm trying to at least to revive this intuition that I think Koskenemi beautifully grasped at a very early stage, but also dismissed and didn't understand that it was bigger.
I have a question.
Yes.
So basically, you said at the very end of your presentation that these techniques are getting the peacekeeping operation less political. How do you draw the line? And this actually collides with Mariela's question. How do you draw the line between political and non-political? Because exactly the goal of this managerial practice is to prevent war or minimize minimize risk or this kind of stuff. So there is a political goal. It's just the techniques that are changing. So how are these techniques getting less political? This is very theoretical.
Yeah, no, I understand. There is an ambiguity when you use this word political. What does it mean? I don't mean as a separate thing. Totally. I mean when I say that, I mean that there is very little room for actors to make a case about their political motives. Right? Understanding the reasons or the structure of a conflict is not just understanding the economic or database facts that create it. But I think there is a reason, or at least there is a space to understand the reason why people resort to force. That is not necessarily entirely present in the way international law opens the door to it, right? But there is still something, right? It was already a problem, I think, with the charter, that there was very little motives why we could do a war, and you needed to put it there in these little boxes. But still, this was conceived as a discussion around the table in which you would frame your argument. But there would be a space in which, of course, in a very constrained argumentative game, you could say things. International critical tradition, international criticized this heavily, right? Of how this was already a very dry debate. But this, I think, there is no more forum in which this is discussed, right? There is no space in which there is a claim for that. It's just about proportionality and cost benefits, etc. The discussion. So I think there was more space to explain why you wanted, why you were a terrorist, or why you would resort to private use of force in the 70s and 80s than there is today. There is no room to discuss the motives. None. It's just a behavior. It's how it's understood. So that's what I mean by saying that it's less political. There's less engagement with the motives why you would this. It doesn't matter. Nobody cares. There's no space. There's no argument available to give a motive. Not even self-defense. I mean, not even the most technical motive, right? There's none. Which this is what I mean. Is the word in this.
Thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting. But I have a question, small questions,
Yes.
on the tool that you use for the managerial governance that lead to the cost-benefit analysis. You mentioned a lot of the use of indicator that you use for the security measurement. You mentioned a lot of the indicator from very authorized places like the World Bank or OECD, but I just want to know that have you ever tried some kind of the indicator from the private sector, for example, like the World Justice Project, that they provide some kind of the security factor that have seen a lot from that, and also is that effective? Is that more effective than the on the providing your conclusions or something?
Very good question. So, of course, there's a big market for these indicators, and it's quite, considering the scale that they're operating on, it's quite cheap, right? So anyone can produce an indicator. Almost, not anyone, but it's reasonably accessible for all sorts of private actors. So NGOs have engaged heavily in this. Private companies have engaged heavily in this. My criteria to talk about them. So I'm interested in all of them, and very interested in the sociology of how one indicator gets to win the race and another not. Right? So I'm very interested in this. But I think that in this case, these indicators have produced something for sure, but I haven't seen one that has won. There is no ranking like the Beijing ranking of universities that has a private ranking that has won the race. At least for now, but it might be there. I mean, there is a wide offer. I am not that sure about cyber world. I think it might be that in the cyber world, private tools will win because they have access to private data that nobody has access to, and I think that this will make a big difference. I assume that if this continues like this, and the privatization of data, that these tools will be the powerful tools will be private tools. Right? So already we see in profiling and very data-intensive tools that it's private companies that own these indicators or these flagging tools. Right? The big databases that flags suspicious financial behavior is private, and so the more you need data, the more it will go to private, I guess. But the World Bank had still a reach to get some data, but it already feels a bit old to have like one indicator a year. That is also self-monitored. It's the state answering a form and sending back to the World Bank. It feels already old. I feel that this is not gonna stay at the center. But for now it is.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I understand this work to be a work on intersections. Especially refer to categories that draw from the use of force and bloodshed, and at times even business and human rights. So when we talked about high-risk zones. So I'll try to make a summary for myself and for maybe even your benefit. So the first argument to me, it's an argument on the expansion of the geographical scope of application of bloodshed. So when we refer to normalizing violence and a sort of permanent state of emergency, and you refer to targeting, I seem to understand that this has to do with how the world has become the geographical area for the application of bloodshed, and not just limited areas where in principle it should apply. The second argument is an argument on transparency, so to what extent something that is codified in an algorithm is still intelligible to lawyers. So to what extent can a decision making that has to do with the law and is adopted on the basis of an algorithm is subjected to our scrutiny. And the third strand of your presentation is, to me, about changing criteria or categories, so changing actors, changing instruments, and eventually where we find something that is relevant for the law. And I think you made reference to what is inside the law and what is sidetracked. And so in code of conducts, private complaint mechanisms, security indicators that you refer to. And I'm thinking to what extent reinforcing the narrative about this divide makes you a favor, in a sense. And to what extent is this just a matter of perspective?
Yeah, so I was gonna answer you with what you end with. In a sense, I by start disregard this distinction between law and non-law. But for explanatory purposes, I want to still explain that, of course, I understand there is a difference. I'm not, but in order to do this, in order to see across this, I need to, at one moment, to be blind to this distinction. Otherwise, I would be also embedded in silos that would make me see, the International Criminal Court as more important than the World Bank. There is, of course, a moment in which I decide to be blind. Now, I also want to distinguish the sort of effect that this has. I think it has a different normative effect, where normative is ambiguous in English, but a different regulatory effect in terms of shaping behavior. It just has a different way of being important, or a different way of matter. At the global level. So I'm interested in that, but not when I try to look at it at the beginning, right? So part of my research is totally uninterested in distinguishing international law from the global law. Not interested. I just want to see what's regulating global governance, the global plane. But of course, I understand when I go into these instruments, they function in a different way. And I'm interested in the way they perform effects or bindingness in a different way. I'm very interested in this because I'm a lawyer and this is what I'm in for. But at methodological level, I think that we need to, if we want to move away from where we're stuck in international, we need to allow ourselves to be a bit blind to a non-law distinction. But in a very prudential moment.
Because I think when you talked about intensity and proportionality, this is precisely where I think making the distinction from where we draw to claim intensity is a certain thing, or proportionality means something in a certain context, is where it matters.
Absolutely, so that's why I distinguish this, but I think that it also needs to be understood. So proportionality, you can understand it from the decision of the International Court, and then you can look at the documents of the Joint Chief of Tax, for instance, or the actual technology that is implemented to calculate the collateral damage, and you get a different picture, right? And I think that the machine that decides what is a proportional collateral damage has also a lot of regulatory power that has probably more than the decisions of the International Court, of Criminal Court. Right? That's what I mean. At one point, it's good to stay inside of international to understand the bindingness and to of course understand how these reasoning are embedded within our own tools. But it's also interesting to go outside of it, or outside what we consider it. And we can also move this border. Huh? We are the one owning the disciplinary border. We can also decide that we can move it just a little bit outside of it. This is in our power. And to decide that this is also of relevance to us, to look at how it's actually implemented and what are the tools on which actors are relying to perform these decisions, I think is important. So I'm very much interested in this distinction, but in a sense, in a teleological way. I think I use this distinction for a purpose, or I don't use it for another. I don't want to bind myself to a method that will then forbid me to see other things. That's for sure. I'm not sure I understood what you meant by this point of transparency or intelligibility to lawyers. I'm very happy to discuss this theme of intelligibility of algorithmic devices. I'm not sure that what I want or that I dream of is intelligibility. I don't think that this is possible. I think it's not intelligible for data scientists neither. It's not at this level that it's happening. I think that by a strange turn of things, the actual tool that is useful now to understand what is the effect of these algorithmic devices is to go to a very classical political economy tool, which is distributive analysis. We don't understand the reasoning, but we also maybe don't care. What we also want to look at is what it produces. Who does it give the right to kill to? This is maybe an interesting way to look at these algorithmic devices rather than trying to continue to understand the reasoning, as if we didn't know that the reasonings that we study in law for centuries are all the construction made on a decision that was previously made. We know that, right? So maybe the reasoning is not that important, and we need to look at the effects and what actually is the distribution effect of these tools. So I'm not sure I'm totally in favor of transparency of these tools, or at least in the way they reason. Of course, there is a lot of interesting things to see in the way they are built and in the way the lawyers discuss with engineers in building algorithmic devices, but I also think that it's not necessarily useful. Also, it's impossible. We know it's impossible to look at how this reasoning is made, right? It's not possible to understand the reasoning of an artificial intelligence device. It's not a thing.
Then in the context of IHL, you will have a specific rule for that. There is Article 36 or 81, preventing the contracting parties to develop technologies that would not allow to comply with their existing obligations under international law.
I think that we can have if we want to talk about regulatory development or legal development, I think it's more interesting to have a rule that says we need to assess the results of your calculating device. If this device systematically kills more than it should, or more than what we consider acceptable, or systematically kills black men, well, we have a problem, right? So we can also see a regulatory project that is about the outcome and not necessarily the reasoning, right? So I don't think that saying, well, we want to ban every device that we don't understand is both feasible and interesting, right? In the sense that I don't want to understand how Google Maps knows where I should go. I just want to make sure that it actually gets me the right result, right? So if the result is systematically false or over, favor that a certain type of shops, then I want to know that this is a problem. But I don't necessarily need to know the whole reasoning to see that. That's my point. Or remove the way of it.
We still have time. The gorillas are not going to kill us out. When I was born, they
Well, we were lurking outside before, but
I'm scared.
we can tie the way.
Ian, you should defend us. If the security comes in. No, I think it's a very important claim, and it's a very big claim you're making, and I can really see why this has a huge potential to really shed a greater light on the losers and the winners. I think there's a great potential, and I actually like the way you've presented it today. It's quite convincing. It would be, I don't know whether you've presented your claim in more orthodox temples like ULB with Olivier Corten or Ghent with Tom Huys, but I'd be happy to be there when you do so, because you may have to call 911 and say it will come as a shock.
Yeah.
I quite like your expression. Did you say an Uberized way of contributing to hostilities? I think there's much there. I'd like to, when we go for drinks afterwards, I'd like to explore the idea of the Uberization of contribution to hostilities. Now, for now, I'd just like to, and it's not surprising, I'd like to challenge your claim at 3 levels. And I mean, I know you have an answer, so it's just so I mean it very nicely, and I know it's just a way for you to elaborate on it. But so you say that there is this move from prohibition to management of security, the movement from binary categories to a spectrum, and you put this into a general picture of a move away from the modern project of law, and you have this nice linear narrative. Well, so this is the descriptive part of your work. So I'd like to raise 3 objections. One of them actually was already touched upon by Mariella, and that's the challenge of the causality and the historical narrative. Right? Because one objection could be, well, this managerialism has been, at least as far as the UN Charter is concerned, has been with us since the start of the Cold War. And in a way, this managerialism is just an accident triggered by the Cold War. The Charter didn't work, and eventually we were forced into peacekeeping, and peacekeeping is a managerial or a management mechanism. So this turn to managerialism and the management of security occurred much earlier and has been with us for quite some time. And you could even push it further. You could say this turn to managerialism, or the management of security, can be traced back to the Charter itself, because the Charter didn't have this binary approach to violence. It already had this wide spectrum, non-intervention, use of force, aggression, threat to the peace, and so on. So we already have this spectrum. So that would be, I would say, the historical and maybe formal objection, which is it has been with us for quite some time. Then I would like to challenge your taxonomy. You have this sort of taxonomy: formalism, functionalism, managerialism. And this taxonomy, or this 3-tier taxonomy, allows you to build this linear narrative. But you seem to hold them as being distinct. But somehow the examples of the management of security you provided, they have these very strong functional and formal overtones. And you give the example of security and the move towards risk-based, the example of proportionality and risk-based proportionality. But it's still very functional and very formal. So in that sense, I wonder whether you can really describe your move in terms of formalism, functionalism, managerialism, because they are so intertwined. And managerialism still needs functionalism and formalism. So that's the challenge of your taxonomy. And then the third one is a more maybe theoretical challenge, which is your idea of modernity. You seem to present managerialism as a move away from modernity in the modern project of law. And it's true that we think of modern law as the opposite, as a tool of government. Law is an instrument, another tool of government. But couldn't you make the claim that this is not at all a move, is that managerialism was already there in the modern idea of law? When we came with the idea that law is an instrument that is a repository of the will of the political community, maybe it was meant to be a way to manage the political community itself. So I'm challenging you, I know you have an answer to all this, but it's just because I'm fascinated by the topic and I just want to make you speak a bit more.
Thank you very much, because it's a very, it's a very good analysis. But I probably didn't, there is an ambiguity because I'm trying to do a genealogy from a structuralist analysis. And of course, they don't work together as much as one wants. So in a sense, for didactic purposes, I try to show what different moments of legal mindset produces an ideal type of a legal reasoning, right? A typical factualist to a typical functionalist to etc. And of course, these are never pure, and they're of course evolving. The reason why I do this this genealogy, this history of genealogy, is precisely to understand both the continuity and the difference of the managerial project. So I totally agree with you that probably parts of the germs of managerialism are part of the history of international law. Actually, management and international law are born together in the same moment, in the same countries, right? So it's of course part of the same intellectual backward patterns that lead to these ideas that it's part of engineering the world, right? So this project is completely gets together. And of course, there are moments in which they meet, particularly at the end of the Second Cold War, we are in the Second Cold War, at the end of the Second War, where actually risk management emerges because there's a worry about nuclear plants. And so this is where the theory of risk management is embedded. So there are many moments in which the history of managerial thought and the history of legal thought meet. But what I'm describing here, I think, is when they win, because it has not always won. There was, I think that, of course, there is a very strong engagement with non-formal categories in the charter, and this is what I'm showing. It's like it's a move away from formalism. It's an engagement with facts, with real, a sociological look at war that uses. It doesn't want to use these formal words of war and peace, and wants to look at actual force or conflict or hostilities. That it's really there is an engagement with this idea that we want to look at facts, but not to this extent. But this is always where you draw the line of what's the same and what's different. But I think that at one point it becomes enough to say that it's a different project. It has enough differences to say that it's transformed. I don't mean to say that it's a move away from modernity. This is the history of modernity. In a sense, this hyper-positivism, this hyper-factism that there is in managerialism is almost a success of the positivist dream, right? This is actual science of conflict. It's not broad categories. We are getting at it. We actually have now a science that is called conflict studies that actually has that on it. So it's, in a sense, totally the same story. But partly, of course, there is at least ideas about what a legal reason should be that they are lost in the way, but preferred for some countries. So there are both big differences, but also a continuity. This is always the difficulty in trying to tell a genealogy, right? Is that they are not necessarily. So they are different, but they partake to the same line of history.
Well, on behalf of Ian and Sean and the law committee, thank you, Delphine.
Thank you.